I first watched Alien when I was about 11 years old. My horror movie obsessed mum had been introducing me to some of her favourite films for a while, and she finally decided that I was ready to watch what would eventually become one of the most important parts of my life: 1979's Alien. At the time, my taste in film was very sci-fi heavy, and despite my major shift to horror, Alien has always been number one. If I had Letterboxd at the age of 10, it'd probably look something like this, but as I've grown, it's shifted to this. Anyway, from the second I first laid my stupid little eyeballs on the screen and saw the Nostromo for the first time, I was in love. This film absorbed me. I became one with it, and I still am. I became obsessed, and that obsession became a special interest. For the holistic people watching, autistic people tend to develop something called a special interest, an intense obsession or focus on varied topics. They are significantly more intense than standard interests and hobbies and can take up the large majority of a person's free time or general attention. Anyway, the point is, Alien took over my life. But my view on Alien and my attachment to the film and the world that surrounds it has changed and morphed into something very different as I've gotten older. When I first watched this film in 2015, my 11-year-old brain was focused on one thing and one thing only: the practical effects. Of course I paid attention to the story, but the effects blew my mind. This is a film from 1979, and its practical and visual effects have aged better than films from the mid-2010s. My head could not rid the nagging obsession of Alien, of how they achieved such grossness and such horror, all that tension in such a simple way. But now, I still adore the effects, and that will always be a vital and huge part of my love for Alien, but my focus has shifted from the visual portrayal of horror to the harrowing written parallels to real life, all of which I will cover in this video, but first, some context to this film's release. The year is 1979. Ridley Scott has one theatrical release under his belt, and Dan O'Bannon has just worked with John Carpenter on 1974's Dark Star. Star Wars is dominating the media with its 1977 fanfare, and Fox is desperate to produce a sci-fi film. With a few scripts sat on their desk, their only real sci-fi script is Alien, written by Dan O'Bannon and Ronald Shusett. A sci-fi horror. After Ridley Scott was on board, we had the makings of a masterpiece. Early expectations were for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre of sci-fi. At the time, Texas Chainsaw Massacre was one of the most controversial films ever made, evoking legitimate fear in the audience, so safe to say, they set the bar high. In fact, Dan O'Bannon had Ridley Scott and Walter Hill watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as homework for their work on Alien, and both of them said that it helped a lot as inspiration. And I definitely see where that inspiration shines, especially in the pacing, that slow, tense build leading to an explosive finale. This is one of my favourite examples of two films being connected in their production because it's two of my all-time favourite films. Now, to me, Alien holds a very important place in the history of horror and filming in general. And I'm aware that I'm speaking from a position of bias, but I think it's undeniable to acknowledge the importance of Alien in cinema. But I want to talk about its importance in the real world, its messaging, and how that often gets overlooked. I'm prepared for people to tell me that I'm reaching or something like it's not that deep, but I think it is. I think within Alien there is a vital message that still has an incredible amount of relevance today. Maybe even more relevant than it had in 1979. And to truly explain that message and its significance, there's a lot to cover, so let's start with something simple: the characters. There are a total of 9 characters, including the titular Alien, 10 if you include Mother. We have Warrant Officer Ellen Ripley, Captain Arthur Dallas, Executive Officer Thomas Kane, Navigation Officer Joan Lambert, Chief Engineer Dennis Parker, Engineering Technician Samuel Brett, Jones the Cat, and Science Officer Ash. Something that I loved almost immediately about the characters of Alien is how real they felt. Every conversation and interaction feels so natural. Described as truckers in space, Alien set out to create a believable atmosphere reminiscent of real hardworking people, replicating the attitudes and behaviours of people that work for a large corporation that doesn't care about them. And even though they don't talk about it, you can tell that they know Weyland-Yutani does not care. Most sci-fi films tend to portray their astronauts or passengers as somewhat grand. Even unintentionally, there's this separation from the real world that occurs when depicting characters in sci-fi, whether it's Star Wars or Star Trek or Dune or 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'm not saying that that is necessarily a fault of any of these films, but there is a lack of relatability to their situation. Even though you might be able to relate to the character as an idea or their approach to the challenges they face, the situations they are in feel so distant. Alien doesn't feel like that. It feels real. It feels grounded. Now, I know what some of you might think. How does it feel grounded? It's a sci-fi movie set in the year 2122 about a bunch of truckers in space encountering a murderous alien. But trust me, it really does feel grounded. As far as the characters are concerned, they feel grounded because it feels like you know them. You don't see any of their life before the Nostromo. You hear small mentions of their lives back home, but that's all you get. Small mentions. Just enough to make them people. In a relatively short amount of time, Alien manages to make every single one of these people real. Now, that can be credited to two main things: the acting and the dialogue. The dialogue throughout is incredibly well written and incredibly believable, but specifically in the moments before ever encountering the xenomorph, the dialogue is small, insignificant. In the grand scheme of the whole story, what they're talking about doesn't matter. But that's why it matters. In real life, people in these situations have insignificant conversations. They talk about their day, their lives, small things. Small talk. A lot of films will brush over that, especially in such an unrealistic setting, or they will create small talk that is relevant to the world you're watching, but Alien creates small talk that you could believe people having in the real world. When characters in something like Star Wars engage in simple conversation or small talk, there's still something very fictional about it. Something far off. They're talking in a way that feels familiar, but what they're talking about is so separate from us. Womp rats, skyhoppers, going to the Tashi station to pick up some power converters. The tone of their voice makes it sound normal, but the words that they're using go against that. And again, that's not necessarily a flaw with those films. What those films use as normal conversation works very well in building their world, but for Alien, I think that those normal, boring human conversations is what makes the situation feel so real. Then there's the acting. It feels so natural. And yes, that is a credit to the cast being made up of some very talented actors, but their ability to live in the world they are creating is, in my opinion, the biggest factor contributing to that. The way they move and interact with the set and each other feels so comfortable. Feels like they own the place, like they are home. No worry about being careful with the set pieces because it's theirs. This realism goes a long way to contributing to the horror of the film, because at its core, this film is a horror film. And one of the most important factors of a horror film is its people. There's importance to having someone to put yourself to, and what I mean by that is having somebody to relate to in a horror film, or any film for that matter, is obviously important to your ability to care about that situation. Now, again, I'm not saying that that is 100% necessary. There are a lot of films where a lack of relatability is important, but I find that when it comes to horror, a lot of the fear comes from the idea of being in that situation yourself. And to this day, I am yet to find a film that portrayed that as well as Alien. You feel like you know the Nostromo crew. They feel like real people, people you understand. Maybe the only thing in the film you truly do understand. And I think it's that connection that allows you to so easily imagine what this situation is like for them. And I think that's a large contributing factor as to why so many people describe Alien as the first film that truly scared them. To move towards talking about the characters as individuals, specifically the humans, they all play very significant but very different roles. Dallas, he's the man in charge. He's your very typical guy with power. Not necessarily in an obvious and obnoxious way, but he definitely knows that he has a higher position than everybody. And in the simplest ways, he lets them know that. Brett and Parker feel like dumb friends. The two engineers on the team laughing and giggling to themselves about stupid things, not really taking things too seriously until it's too late. The way they don't take Ripley seriously, even in situations that don't fully require it. They failed to really give her minimal respect, which I feel adds to their believability. Lambert fulfills a relatively stereotypical role for women in horror. She's terrified. She still sustained a lot of that realism that adds to the other characters, but you could also argue that her almost exaggerated fear adds to her realism, because her fear isn't really exaggerated. It's probably the most realistic reaction that any person watching this film would have in that situation, but in comparison to the rest of the crew, she is arguably the most scared. Then there's Kane. While not developed too much for obvious reasons, he still manages to sustain that realism, and there's a certain likability about him. They all have roles, and they all fulfill them. That makes up the bulk of our Nostromo crew, but that's not all of them. There are two more, perhaps the most important two. This is Ash, a synthetic member of the crew, the science officer. Ash is possibly the second most interesting character in this film. Ash isn't human. He is a cold, heartless synthetic, an artificial person, an android. Throughout the film, there are many examples of men not listening to Ripley, and I will develop on why that is important later on, but for right now, I want to focus on how Ash as a character contributes to that. Ash does not listen to Ripley when it is most important that someone does. When Ripley threatens what Ash wants, and I use wants loosely, he becomes violent, putting her life in danger, putting his goals above her survival, going as far as to try to kill her to protect his desires. To me, Dallas, Brett, Parker, and Kane all represent various types of men in these kinds of situations, and how they would act in this specific situation. But Ash represents men as a whole. I'm sure everyone that watches this will be familiar with the argument of, it's not all men, and I think that argument is very relevant here. I could make allegories and comparisons to explain my viewpoint on that issue, but I think the important thing to know is that when people say all men, they do not mean that it is literally every single man alive. Not every single shark is going to kill you, but if you see one when you're swimming, you're probably going to swim away. Think about it like this. If I made you a batch of brownies, and I told you that 3 of the 10 brownies had my shit inside of them, would you take the risk and eat a brownie? Now, I'm hoping that your response to that is no. There is a difference between individual men and men as an institution, a system, a hive mind. To quote Scottish comedian Daniel Sloss,
"But when 1 in 10 men are shit and the other 9 do nothing, they might as well not fucking be there. If you are sick of the narrative that is currently going on about men, feel free to change it, but you have to get involved. Don't make the same mistake I did for years, which was just sitting back and be like, well, I'm not part of the problem, therefore I must be part of the solution."
For some reason, a lot of men struggle to see it from the perspective of someone at risk. As I said, when people say all men, they are not referring to every single individual man being at fault. They are not throwing blame at every single man. They are not accusing every single man. But what does a bad man look like? What does a rapist look like? That's a question you can't answer. At least not specifically, because the only answer you can really give is they look like everyone else. So I bring you back to the question about the brownies. If I baked you 10 brownies and told you that there was human shit in 3 of them, would you eat one? I know, it sucks, but it's the sad and horrific reality for every woman everywhere. How can you blindly trust every man when the ones that want to hurt you look like the ones that don't? How do you know that you are eating a safe brownie? It's frankly upsetting to have to put things in such childish terms, but unfortunately we have gotten to a point where it is that difficult to get the message across. Now, as I said, I think Ash represents men as a whole, because as I've made pretty clear, bad men look like good men. They blend in, which is what Ash does. He is not a human being, but you don't know that until it's too late. Ripley trusts her crew, which includes Ash. Obviously, she doubts them from time to time, but she never thought her life was at risk. But it was. As soon as Ash got the chance, he took it. And let's not forget that the way in which Ash ignored Ripley was by letting the danger on board. Ash, representing men in this situation, is the reason that women were in danger, because they allowed that danger to become a part of their society. Supporting the idea that men and their behaviour is what allows rape to still be such a prominent part of our society. I think Ash is so important to this film's meaning. A dangerous man hiding amongst the others, only revealed to be dangerous when it's too late, because he looks just the same as the rest of them. A situation that a lot of women can relate to and a lot of women are familiar with. He isn't even the main threat, but he is. His role in the story is really interesting to me because he is a secondary threat that fulfills a similar meaning as the main threat, and I will get onto that later, but right now there is only one main character left to talk about. Ellen Ripley. Ellen Ripley is, in my opinion, the single greatest character ever written. I've made it clear that Alien is my favourite film of all time, and a lot of that can be credited to how much I like Ellen Ripley. I think she is the best example of the characters feeling grounded and relatable. When she's frustrated, you are frustrated. When she's stressed, you are stressed. When she's winning, you're happy, and when she's losing, you're sad. And I know a lot of that sounds simple, the kind of basic stuff that you expect from any main character in a story. But I don't think any of them do that as well as Ellen Ripley. I don't think I've ever rooted for a character as much as I root for Ellen Ripley. There is a reason that Ripley is such a strong character, such a beloved character, and it's not just her stubbornness, being too stubborn to be killed, her determination, her likability, how naturally funny she is. It's how perfectly imperfect she is. She has human flaws, she makes human errors, but she is still an incredible character who, at times, feels like an unstoppable force. Over the past month, maybe a bit longer, me and my girlfriend have been having an ongoing conversation about women in fiction, how they are written and where it works and doesn't work. There are countless, and I genuinely mean countless. It would be impossible to count how many male characters are well-written, complex, compelling characters. The same really can't be said about women. Now, 99% of the time, this is a problem of women being written by men who don't know how to write women, but we have managed to come up with some examples of well-written women in fiction, most notably Laura Palmer in Twin Peaks, Kiki in Kiki's Delivery Service, Wednesday and Morticia Addams in the 90s Addams Family movies, Graham and Megan in But I'm a Cheerleader, Clementine in The Walking Dead, and almost the entire cast of Bottoms. I will link the full list below, but to me, number one is Ellen Ripley. When male characters are written to be strong characters with determination and heroic traits, they are usually written as complex characters with difficult and detailed backstories, purpose. Whereas when women get written to be characters with determination and heroic traits, they either get written as perfect, completely flawless superhumans, or made up of nothing but stereotypes, completely lacking that relatability. But Ripley isn't that. She is a complex character. When men get written to be strong, determined heroes, their complexity isn't necessarily shown in a single scene of them describing their entire backstory. It's done in simple ways. Their character development, subtle parts of their attitude and behaviour, their interactions with other characters. And that's exactly what Ripley has. She feels like a developed character. She feels real, even though the situation is so unrealistic. She's surviving against all odds, a situation that, to be honest, very few people watching the films would even have a small chance of surviving. This is something that men take for granted in their characters because it's expected, it's the norm. It's harder to list a bunch of male characters that don't get that treatment. This shouldn't be something revolutionary. This shouldn't be something unique that I can point out about a character. The main thing that makes Ripley stand out as a well-written character is that she's been well-written. Don't get me wrong, she is an exceptionally well-written character, but that development that she gets, that detail and thought that there has been put into her character, should be the norm. But unfortunately, it isn't. Even Sigourney Weaver recognised this. She's quoted as saying, "I remember thinking women aren't allowed to play these warriors, and I've been handed this opportunity to play a woman who becomes a warrior, and goes from someone rational to someone who's completely instinctive. The arc of the character was so incredible." Now to me, that quote perfectly sums up Ripley's development. Starting as the most rational in the group, many steps ahead of her fellow crew members, but because of their ignorance, she's forced to work on instinct. Given no other option, she has to fend for herself. Anyway, as I mentioned, at its core, this is a horror film. And horror is an interesting genre. A lot of people don't like it, and I understand why. It's depicting horrific, terrifying, and sometimes disgusting things. Things you don't want to see or think about, which interestingly is why a lot of other people do want to watch it. It invokes something in you, a morbid curiosity, a thrill for fear. It takes those shameful impulses of humanity and throws them back at you. But a lot of horror movies do more than that. They don't just scare you, but they instill a secondary fear through their writing, taking that safety you have in fiction and showing you that those horrors can be in your world too. I'm noticing an increase in people denying meaning behind the art they consume, claiming that it's not that deep. And I think that's ignorant. This isn't to call anyone out, but I'm asking people to look further into the art around them because I truly believe that no art is without meaning. But before I can get onto the full meaning behind this film, I need to cover the core writing first. Alien is a sci-fi film. People are very familiar with sci-fi as a genre. It's been going for almost as long as film. Now, this is partly due to humanity's fascination with space, the idea of life out there, and humanity's desire to touch the stars, and unfortunately, people's desire to capitalize on that. Now, there are several major films and franchises that scratch that itch. There's some that do it well, and there's some that don't, but there are many that have stuck with people for decades, whether it's John Carpenter's The Thing, or Star Wars, or Star Trek, Terminator, Transformers, The Matrix, Spaceballs, Superman, Mars Attacks, or A Trip to the Moon. But sci-fi films tend to fall into different categories. You have stuff like Star Wars, which is very much its own world. It's not intended to be a continuation of humanity as we know it, it's its own entity. Star Wars is a galaxy at war, reflecting real politics in a junk punk pirate style. Then there's stuff like Star Trek. It's much more idealistic of humanity's ventures into space. Then there's stuff like The Thing, Terminator, Matrix, Transformers, Superman, Mars Attacks. They are the idea of outer space coming to us, confronting humanity's fear of being invaded. But Alien is a grounded future of humanity, a future where humanity realistically progressed and made its mark on the universe. The world of Alien is a lot more detailed and thought out than people tend to give it credit for. It has detailed history on the politics, historical events, important figures, and pretty much everything else we have about our own real history. We know how the Earth is governed, the first colonies, how they were formed, the major corporations, the political influence of those corporations, how the military works, differences in culture, belief, people's lives, small details that so many other stories don't really touch on. And even the stories that do, like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, two of the most detailed worlds in fiction, still fall a little short on that realism because the world that you are applying those details to is so fantastical and separate from our own that even though you can identify the countries of Middle-earth and the governments and systems of the planets in Star Wars, it's still not going to feel as real as Alien because Alien's governments, corporations, they function very similar to our own in such a believable way that you could genuinely believe that future Earth is our own. That isn't to say that no other sci-fi universe has applicable world building. To go back to Star Wars, it parallels the Nazis so frighteningly well that it's still relevant. But to me, humanity's realistic development in Alien will always stand out. Now, as for the actual plot of the film itself, it follows some pretty standard horror storytelling. You're introduced to the characters slowly, and almost immediately you get to see them in a normal situation. Obviously, it's not entirely normal, they are in a long-haul space vessel over 30 light years away from Earth, but the atmosphere and dialogue are very familiar. You get to see them as people before shit hits the fan. They pick up a distress signal on a faraway moon, receive orders to land and investigate the signal, and after finding some form of life and being almost instantly attacked, they make the stupid decision of bringing it on board. This inevitably leads to their deaths, but not Ripley's. She is our survivor, our hero. That is not to say that you don't fear for her life. There are many moments in this that on my first watch I thought she was going to die. But when you really look at the entire story, from the beginning, she was the smartest person there. And her being the smartest, and the way in which she is the smartest, serves a very interesting purpose. If everyone else just simply listened to her, their fate would have been a lot less violent. But instead, their decisions to ignore her and make the mistakes that they made led to their deaths in what was, at the time, one of the most horrific fates for a group of characters in cinema. As I mentioned, a lot of people found this to be a terrifying film when it was first released. Even just on its surface as a simple horror film, it was a masterclass in building tension. And that tension can be credited to the symbolism throughout the film that subconsciously implanted terror into the minds of the audience, and the visuals. I'm going to explain both, and the role they both played. I'm going to start with the symbolism because that's my favourite part and the main reason I'm here. Now, before I can really dive into the symbolism and messaging in this film, I do need to give a small disclaimer. I know I have already spoken about connections to some sensitive topics, but this is where I'm going to go into a lot of detail, so I feel that I need to have some sort of trigger warning for topics like sexual assault and rape and sexual violence in general, so please be warned. As I've mentioned, this film is a horror movie, and while there is a lot of horror created from the visual effects and practical effects, and the tension from the score and the camera work, to me the most horrific and legitimately unsettling aspect of the horror in Alien is in the writing. I'm going to start by reading a quote from Dan O'Bannon. "That's how I'm going to attack the audience. I'm going to attack them sexually. And I'm not going after the women in the audience. I'm going to attack the men. I'm going to put in every image I can think of to make the men in the audience cross their legs. That quote is one of my favourite quotes in the film industry because it's so simple yet shows such an understanding for his work and its message. I'm going to attack the men. And he definitely did, and he did it well. To really break down how that goal was achieved, let's look at the life cycle of the xenomorph. So, we start with the overmorph. Technically we start with the queen, but within the context of the first Alien alone, we don't need to talk about that. Anyway, the overmorph is a sort of egg-like creature that contains a second creature inside of it. Think of the overmorph like a living womb, with a gestating creature inside. Interestingly, it originally had a much more vaginal design, but it was deemed too much of a risk that the film could get into trouble. That creature inside is called a facehugger. When the overmorph detects life, its petals open, allowing the facehugger inside to break free. The facehugger then does as its name implies. It wraps itself tightly around the head of the life form, securing itself by constricting its tail around the neck. It then forces its proboscis down the throat, keeping the host breathing, but also it implants a xenomorph embryo into the esophagus. Once the host has been forcefully impregnated, the facehugger dies. Its purpose has been served. Once the host has been impregnated, they are as good as dead. There is no hope. Once the facehugger releases its victim, the victim will wake up, and for a short while they will feel fine. But after not much time, they will start to feel pain. A horrible, agonizing pain. As the embryo that was implanted inside them, which has now grown substantially, pounds against the inside of their chest. It then does as its name implies, and the chest burster breaks through the ribs and escapes, killing the host in the process. The chest burster then flees and finds somewhere to hide where it can continue growing outside of the host. Once it is fully grown, it becomes what we all know as the xenomorph. The xenomorph is then devoted to creating more. It can do this in several ways. Their biology is fascinating and seems to be entirely dedicated to growing in numbers. And pretty much every single method they have to do that results in the death of all other life. Reproduction-based genocide, I guess you could call it that. Their options for reproduction are all pretty brutal. The standard method is the xenomorph will drag victims back to the hive, trap them surrounded by overmorphs, allowing a facehugger to latch onto the host and birth a new xenomorph. As this is happening, more overmorphs being birthed by the queen. But in desperate and dire situations, xenomorphs do have contingency plans. In very specific and extreme circumstances, a standard drone does technically have the ability to become itself a queen, allowing it to create more overmorphs in the hopes to continue the species. But probably the most brutal and most terrifying way, especially when you see it, is a process called egg morphing, in which a xenomorph will coat its victim in the thick like resin substance that they excrete, which contains enzymes and hormones to essentially turn a living creature into an overmorph. It's pretty horrific and one of the darker parts of Alien. Interestingly, egg morphing was something that was originally featured in the 1979 film, but it got cut, and I wish it didn't, because it's genuinely the most terrifying scene in the entire film. This life cycle is very carefully written and perfectly adds to the allegory by expanding on the physical manifestation of sexual violence, making it more than just brutality, but a slowly and carefully executed assault. There are many things contributing to this allegory, some visual aspects which I will get onto later, but the main aspect is the forceful impregnation and the violence afflicted upon the victims. The reason this is such an interesting allegory is the choice of victims. Most of the victims are men, and the sole survivor is a woman. Now that is very important. In the real world, women are already hyper-aware of sexual assault. They are aware of the risks they face every day. If this film targeted that fear to the women in the audience, it would have achieved nothing. What are you going to teach them that they don't already know? Dan O'Bannon, in his own words, wanted to attack the men, specifically targeting people that are unaware, or at least not as aware as they should be. I've talked about this in past videos, but for the sake of complete clarity, I will repeat myself. A lot of men ignore sexual assault and rape, both in concept and in practice, ignoring the risks and how they contribute to those risks, whether it's the comments they make to their friends, the attitude they have towards women, or the way that so many men will turn a blind eye when someone is in need of help, or even when they turn a blind eye to some of the stuff that men around them say. If a man you know says something worrying or questionable about women and how he's going to treat them or how he does treat them, and you ignore that because it's not directly affecting you, you are a part of the problem. You might think that you're better because you're not directly doing it. You aren't. I'm sorry to put this so bluntly, but you are an awful person. You are aware of what is happening to people and you chose to do nothing. Made an active decision to do nothing. Messages like this are so important in art. Art can be a revolutionary method at telling a story or warning people of dangers that surround them every day. A tricky part of that is knowing who to target your messages at. As I said, there is no point trying to teach women about the dangers and risks of predatory men. There is nothing that a man could tell a woman about predatory men and the risks that they face that every woman doesn't already know. But something that is unfortunately common, and this is something I've seen firsthand, is how little men really know. So this film puts focus on the men being vulnerable, giving them a character they can relate to, then showing you that those characters are never truly safe, trying to give a glimpse into reality. In an ideal world, people would be able to sympathise and understand the fear and struggles of others without it needing to affect them. But a lot of people, and by people I mean men, are oblivious to things that don't directly affect them. That obliviousness is unfortunately often intentional. They don't fear it, and more often than not, they don't realise how much it affects the women in their lives. Every woman has been affected by this in some way, and if the women in your life haven't made you aware of that, it's probably because they don't trust you. Alien depicts that horrible and terrifying truth as a physical manifestation, something you can't ignore. That physical manifestation obviously being the xenomorph, but how is that actually shown? Each stage in the life cycle serves its own purpose, not just as simple stages in the xenomorph reproduction, but as different parts of the allegory. Starting with the ovomorph, as I said, you could think of it like a living womb. This mainly serves as imagery instead of a purposeful part of the cycle, but with recent events showing that certain men only care about the womb and only see the womb as the purposeful part of the woman, this has become increasingly relevant. Especially when you consider the fact that the corporation is trying to take the wombs for their own financial benefit, reflecting the idea of the government having mass control over women and treating them like reproduction machines rather than people, similar to ideas portrayed in something like The Handmaid's Tale. Interestingly, this isn't the only place in the film where a womb is a part of the imagery. According to Ridley Scott, Mother was warmly lit and created to represent the womb of the ship, seeing the ship as a living organism and the womb at its centre. Mother was intended to represent a safe space, representing that safety from your mother, that safety that is then taken away when the womb is invaded, which in the film is portrayed as Ash entering Mother when Ripley is in there seeking help, leading to him violently attacking her, possibly representing the safety that is taken away by rape, and the pregnancies conceived through rape being seen as invading the womb of the ship. Then moving on to the facehugger. This is the life form that commits the act. It is a vital part of the connection to real-world sexual assault. The violence and aggression of its job and the forceful penetration is probably the most obvious link to the allegory. You could even suggest that the facehugger using its tail to hold the victim's throat might represent the added threat of death that many rape victims face. Especially when you consider the fact that when someone tries to remove a facehugger, that grip around the neck tightens, almost as a warning that if the facehugger cannot impregnate the host, they would rather just kill them than let them live. possibly also representing the grasp that sexual assault holds over many people's lives, but also the behaviour and attitude of predatory men. If they can't have what they want, they would rather ruin someone's life than just go without it. Another thing that many women are aware of whenever they've had to tell a man no. Then we have what is arguably the most brutal part of the cycle, the chest burster. Its birth kills the victim in the process. Now, the chest burster could be connected to the allegory in a few different ways, the most obvious being its representation of the pregnancies conceived through rape, and their potential to ruin lives. In the case of the film, as I said, it literally kills them. As soon as they become impregnated, their life has been ruined. You could see that as a very common theme in stories about sexual assault. The idea that once that has happened to somebody, there is no life afterwards. The idea that it's a permanent hell. Obviously, this is an experience that varies greatly from person to person, and in real life, a lot of people do manage to find a life after. But within fiction, a lot of stories that relate to rape and sexual assault tend to depict the characters as unable to find any life after that happening to them. It consumes them. It becomes them. Their life from that point onwards is permanently changed by the actions of predatory men, a perfect example of men's desire to have control over women. And this film shows that in a very brutal and intense way, through the violent murder of the victim. You could even connect it to the argument between pro-choice and pro-life, the idea that people that are pro-life think that a fetus takes priority over the life of a living woman. And as more and more places, specifically US states, take away women's rights and their access to healthcare, women that are in those situations do not have a choice, similar to the victims in the film. Forcefully impregnated, then given no choice but to carry the embryo until it eventually kills them. Then you have the final stage in the cycle, the xenomorph. Now, the way this links to the allegory is very interesting. When a xenomorph becomes fully grown, their final form varies depending on the species of the host. Now, in alien media over the years, we have seen xenomorphs birth from many different species, but the main one is humans. When a xenomorph is born, they take physical traits from the host, whether it's a xenomorph runner being quadrupedal like their hosts, or a drone taking a humanoid stance and physical build from their hosts. As if it's not awful and traumatic enough that they forcefully impregnate you and kill you, the final xenomorph steals a part of who you are, mirroring how horrible acts of aggression and violence towards women can steal a part of who they are, taking lives, taking safety, ripping their life from under them. Although, the alien and its life cycle only play a part of the role in depicting that allegory. Even though the xenomorph is perceived to be the main threat, there is a more constant, looming threat that is often overlooked. The company, the corporation, Weyland-Yutani. I'm not saying that people are unaware that Weyland-Yutani are the bad guys, but I feel that people often overlook how much that mirrors our world. The crew is only in this situation because of the position that they have been put in by Weyland-Yutani, heavily implying the idea that the threats and dangers that people experience on a day-to-day basis are more often than not the fault of the system. In this case, a large corporation that has a large influence over the world. In the context of the film, those threats and dangers are death in many different forms, but it usually is death. But in the real world, and in the case of what this film is representing, it's sexual assault. It could be interpreted that the decisions made by the corporation that are then carried out by men, despite the protest from a woman, increased the risk, put them in more danger. The very fact that Ripley consistently protested against the decisions that were made and was consistently ignored adds so much more to the meaning behind the film. When it comes to issues like sexual assault, the main people that you should be listening to are women. Even when Ripley is in charge, she's still ignored. Obviously, the person that ignores her is Ash, someone I've already described as representing ignorant men. You could even take that as representing the fact that most men would choose to listen to men about a topic that they don't understand rather than listen to a woman about a topic that they do. To put it simply, men don't treat women with respect and don't see them as worth listening to. They don't see them as people. That hard, deep-rooted, engineered misogyny that seems like a permanent fixture in the mind of man is so dangerously dominant that even when in a situation of such dire and life-threatening circumstances, men still ignore women. To quote something I said in a past video, men feel safe to ignore it because, to put it bluntly, they are the penetrator, not the penetrated. They subconsciously do not see themselves at risk. To further quote that previous video, I also think that's why a lot of predatory and predatory adjacent men tend to be so homophobic, because deep down, they fear that a man will treat them the way they treat women. Now, it's pretty obvious that the most direct and immediate threat to the lives of the Nostromo crew is the fully grown xenomorph. While the company and Ash both pose a threat, it is much more of an indirect secondary threat than the deaths caused by the xenomorph. The xenomorph, to me, is the physical embodiment of sexual assault, which, in the real world, there is a physical embodiment to sexual assault. A rapist. Which I guess you could say that is what the xenomorph is a stand-in for. As soon as it is on board, no one is safe. It is the direct threat. However, I ask, why is it a direct threat? No one is denying that the xenomorph is the danger in this situation, but let's look at the situation in the real world for a second. I already mentioned that the systems in place and the men that enforce it and the men that put those systems in place are at fault for the dangers and risks that women face on a day-to-day basis. Even if they are not the people directly harming these women, they still carry an enormous part of the blame. They put women at risk. They are the reason that those horrible things are possible, and they are the reason that those horrible things keep happening. They are the reason that victims don't get listened to, the reason that women get ignored, when they are simply trying to warn people. Now let's apply that to the film. The xenomorph is what's directly killing the crew, but it wouldn't be able to do that if the company, aka the system, didn't create the situation where that is possible. Even with what the company did, the crew still would have been safe if the men in the crew listened to Ripley. It is one of the most glaring and direct parallels to real life in this entire film, and it connects back to the not all men argument that I referred to earlier. A lot of women will say things along the lines of kill all men, or mention that they would pick the bear, and a lot of sensitive men will complain about these things. If you are so offended by what these women are saying, maybe buck the fuck up and do something about the situation that is causing that. But instead, you focus on complaining about what women are saying about dangerous and predatory men, instead of the dangerous and predatory men themselves. That shows where your priorities truly lie, and frankly, it's fucking embarrassing. A little while ago, I saw a diagram that explained this very well. There are over 4 billion men in the world, and only a very, very small percentage of them are rapists. The less aware would see that and assume that it means that most men are safe, and they would probably think that women are overreacting. But this diagram puts that into a new perspective. Well, new to men. Women have been aware of this for a long time. I couldn't find the original diagram, so I had to recreate it from memory to the best of my ability. Instead of seeing rape as a black and white issue, as if it's just rapists and non-rapists, and they are the only two options, this diagram shows it as more of a spectrum, ranging from men who would prevent a rape, and men who commit rape, assault, and violence against women in general. This shows the smaller acts that support and contribute to the larger act of rape. There are a lot of men who would think that consuming rape porn or making seemingly pro-rape comments are harmless, but that contributes to rape culture, which in the big picture only serves to make the situation worse. Earlier I mentioned that each of the men in the crew represent different types of men in this kind of situation. I think this diagram perfectly represents that. The rest of the crew, while not being at the furthest end of the scale with men who would commit rape, they are still further along the scale than they should be. I think that they represent the men who would casually joke about the topic or make comment on it or even fetishize it. Whereas Ash would more likely represent somebody who would encourage the act or possibly ignore a woman being assaulted. There are many small comments and behaviours that add to rape culture that are also normalised in society, like catcalling, comments like boys will be boys, and victim blaming. These actions have become normalised. They all fit on this spectrum somewhere. So while yes, it is only a small percentage of men that actually rape, that doesn't necessarily excuse the behaviour of other men who don't. In fact, a lot of the behaviour of most men contributes to rape and rape culture as a whole, and it carries a lot of blame for rape being so normalised and the view on victims and how they are treated. I repeat, this is why messages like this in art and artistic expression are so vital. Now, I previously mentioned that the allegory is a combined effort of the writing and the visuals, so let's move on to talking about how the visuals contribute to it. Alien is a visual masterpiece. Maybe I'm biased. I think that Alien is a masterpiece in pretty much every aspect, but when it comes to the visuals, I feel that every single other film falls short in comparison. When it came to deciding what the titular alien would look like, or what the moon would look like, or the derelict ship, they needed an artist. Now, a lot of sci-fi cinema is very recognisable based on their visual style. Star Wars has a very junkyard scraps style, whereas Star Trek is very sleek and perfect. Everything is perfectly efficient in its design. Everything is built for purpose, and everything does the purpose that it's built for. Star Wars took on the work of Ralph McQuarrie, whose concept art and designs fit the kind of style that you would imagine in those worlds, but Alien is its own beast. With all the symbolism in the writing, how do you parallel that in the visuals? Answer? You get the work of Swiss artist Hans Rudi Geiger, an artist very well known for his unsettling biomechanical artwork. His art has such an unsettling and bizarre sexual tone to it. So many of the creatures and structures in his work reflect human genitalia in their design. In my opinion, there was no one else. No one else who could have done Alien as much justice as Geiger did. Even his earliest designs for the xenomorph were harrowing. The penile-shaped head, something that stuck with the design throughout. Even the inside of the derelict, all of the tunnels having a very vaginal shape, everything in Geiger's world being upsettingly sexual. Dan O'Bannon is quoted as saying that, "I saw the inhabitants of this planetoid as tough and primitive, and with an extremely complicated sexual cycle." Geiger definitely fulfilled O'Bannon's vision. That loud, hypersexual design perfectly encapsulated the atmosphere of the message behind the film. The writing gave meaning to the decisions made in the story, but Geiger's art gave uncomfortable visuals that you couldn't look away from. Combine all of that with Ridley Scott's incredible talent for creating an atmosphere, and you have perfection. While there was a cinematographer on set, Ridley Scott actually did a lot of the camera work himself, most of it being handheld, which gave it that panic and stress in the movement throughout scenes. Combining his camera work with the fact that he kept making sets tighter and smaller to make the actors feel more stressed and claustrophobic, and you have tension so thick that you start to get stressed out while watching. Geiger's designs featured several elements that resemble sexual organs, the xenomorph being incredibly phallic, especially its head, adding a visually sexual element to the nature of its violence. Then there are specific scenes that just stood out to me, and there was one in particular that has always been stuck in my mind. I've always struggled to perfectly put into words what I see in the scene, but I'm going to try my best. Ripley hears Lambert screaming, horrifying screams, possibly the most exaggerated screaming in the entire film. She knows that they are in danger, so she runs. She needs to get to her friends as quickly as she possibly can, but in this moment, it seems like the hallways have no end. Never-ending maze keeping her further and further from helping them, and by the time she finally reaches them, it's too late. That alone is horrifying. hearing the victim suffer and being just out of reach, so close yet so far. But this scene is more than that, because as Ripley is trying as hard as she can to get to them, we see what is happening to them in that moment. And this scene to me is so powerful. We see the xenomorph, the physical embodiment, directly attacking the victims, but what is important about how that is shown is the slow movement as it moves towards Lambert. The tail becoming almost penile and phallic in the situation as it threateningly and menacingly approaches her. The way it slowly lifts its tail beneath her. She's backed into a corner, nowhere to go. She knows it's her end. To me, this scene is a visual representation of rape. The pinnacle of the allegory demonstrated in one scene. I've described this to people before and had mixed responses. Some people say that I'm reaching and other people agreeing with me. But ever since I started piecing together the allegory in this film, I haven't been able to get this scene out of my mind. It's so harrowing and incredibly done. I think this scene alone is the best demonstration of every single aspect of this film coming together as one unit to create art. The camera work is tense, the movement of the xenomorph is slow and menacing, a graceful force of evil. This is some of the best lighting we ever get to see the xenomorph in the whole film. And Veronica Cartwright's acting in this scene is phenomenal. And the panic on Ripley's face as she realises deep down that she knows she's not going to make it in time. The score in the background. Every single part of this scene serves its purpose and serves it perfectly. We see the true realisation of horror in the events happening to Lambert, but we also see Ripley battling with the fear of being unable to help, which perfectly reflects the difficulty of getting help in the real world. Victims are consistently shunned, ignored, turned away. Finding help is a challenge, and it's one that still haunts people every day, especially in a world where the majority of rapists don't serve time. A world where in countries like the UK and the US, it can be as little as 2 to 5% of rapists that actually face prison time. In the world we live in, women are constantly under threat, and despite that, they still are not listened to. No matter how much evidence comes forward or how many people suffer. In the world of Alien, it's the same. Ripley, knowing the risks of the crew's decisions, steps in and warns them. But inevitably, she's ignored. The ignorance of man is the end of man, and the awareness of the women is what keeps her alive. For longer than I can count, women have been at risk of harm by men, something that transcends generations, something so firmly rooted in our patriarchal society that the messages of a 57-year-old film are still extremely relevant today. Yet, sadly, something tells me they will be just as, if not more relevant tomorrow.